Hey guys, thank you for stopping by. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And I hope you enjoyed this interview. All right, welcome back to the program. Let's get in now. My guests are with me. Let me start from my immediate left. Professor Yakubu Ochefu is a professor of economic history and development studies at the Benue State University. Prof, good to see you and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Nancy. Good morning, Nigeria. Yes.
And we have another guest, Professor Obi Iwuagwu, is also a professor of economic history, development studies, and public policy at the University of Lagos. He joins us from Lagos virtually. Prof, good morning, and I hope you can hear me and see me. Prof, can you hear me? Prof, can you unmute yourself so that I can hear you? Okay. Okay, while my team communicates with him on that, Prof, let me start with you. This morning I actually put on X, that's former Twitter. In fact, let me read what I said in verbatim so that I don't, I was just reflecting early this morning, and I posted it as I was thinking about it. Nigeria at 64, I wonder how our founding fathers were feeling and the hope they had for Nigeria on the eve of Independence Day. By this time, 64 years ago, what were their aspirations? I'm just reminiscing. That was what I was thinking. I wonder how the Azikiwes and the founding fathers then, September 30, 1960, were feeling. What are your sentiments about this Independence Day? And you just told me before the break that you're an independence baby.
Yes.
Your mom gave birth to you just about 23
3
days later.
Yes.
So you can imagine you were still in your mom's womb by this time, 64 years ago.
Yes. And she used to say to us that while they were doing antenatal, the Saudana of Sokoto will come to the 44 Armed Forces Hospital, because my father was a soldier, and all the women who were expecting babies, he will give them one pound each and tell them to carry the babies carefully, because they are carrying the babies for the future of Nigeria, the new Nigeria. And there was a very popular song in the northern, The Children of the Future, by one of the Hausa praise singers. And so it's a very interesting perspective that you have raised, that if you were to go into the arena where our nationalists who got independence for us by 1960 are in the room, what type of conversation will they be having? Because quite clearly the records show that they were very, very expectant. Not just very expectant, the entire world was very expectant because of the type of developmental milestones Nigeria had shown from 1954 when they started self-governance up until that point. And so, but you see, where it gets interesting has to do with how the independence came to be in the first instance. And a lot of us miss the narrative, or we don't even know the narrative of what went on after the Second World War and up until the period where we now had British self-rule and eventually independence. And so it's, we like to tell the story of the economics of decolonization. Yes, because if you don't understand the economics of decolonization, you will not understand the nature and character of the state that was inherited at independence, from self-rule to independence. Because 1945, the Second World War ended. The British, who were, with the Americans, won that war, were now being compelled by the two new superpowers that emerged after the Second World War, the Russians, the Soviet Union, and America, to decolonize. Because both of them were opposed to colonialism for two different ideological reasons. And that pressure now got the British to fast forward a decolonization agenda that they had set for 300-400 years ahead. Because by their own understanding, they were going to rule, the colonial rule and imperialism was going to be in force for at least 500 years before we'll be ready for independence. In fact, independence was not even in the agenda. Then all of a sudden, the Second World War broke out. They nearly lost the war. The colonies themselves helped in making sure that they won that war. And the people who emerged as leaders of the world now insisted that you must decolonize, because colonialism was the antithesis of free trade for the Americans, while for the Russians it was the antithesis of imperialism. So they forced that agenda. And the British now had to quickly devise a decolonization strategy. And who were the main actors? Our traditional elites, our labor unions, our students, and our nationalists. So this group were the ones who came together to agree on what we were going to do with the colonial state that we inherited. You know, they agreed that it was important that we got independence. But what type of independence, what we were going to do that independence was not in agreement. So the traditional elite, the nationalists, came together to form the leadership of the country at independence, while the students and the workers were the junior partners. You know, so by the time self-rule came, the first set of development agendas began to emerge. It was now clear to everybody that there were certain fundamental questions that were being posed that answers were not being given properly to. First, for example, was on education. What type of education do we give to independent Nigeria? Is it qualitative education or quantitative education? You now see that the various regions went separate ways. On agriculture, what type of agriculture do we invest in? What type of industrialization do we invest in?
Okay.
So there was difference between the nationalists at independence on what to do with the independence they just gotten from the colonial government. And that translated into some of the things we began to see going forward.
Okay.
So there were hopes, very high hopes at independence, but because of the nature and character of the independence that they got, these hopes were dashed.
Okay, I think we'll come back to that in a bit to look at the economic foundations that perhaps we inherited at that time that is that has really affected our economic realities. I mentioned earlier that I also have another professor of economic history and development studies and public policy. Professor Iwuagwu, good morning and welcome to the program. I hope you can hear us now. I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah. Yes, I'm beginning to hear.
Okay, okay, Prof. My question to you is really, I've asked Professor Ochefu here what it was like, 64 years ago, and perhaps what our colonial, our founding fathers were thinking on the eve of Independence Day. But my question to you is that 1960, 64 years ago, was termed as a year of Africa, a year for Africa, because looking down economic history, about 17 countries got independence from colonial rule, from Senegal to DRC to Chad to Niger to Nigeria to Somalia to Cameroon. These countries got independence in 1964. How do you think that our journey from 1964 till now has shaped us? 1960 to now have shaped us 64 years down the line. And we can talk about the economic foundations that Professor Ochefu alluded to earlier.
Thank you, Nancy. The truth is, if you put it on balance, we have not fared any better. We have not fared any better at all, because for me, I don't want to keep blaming the colonial masters for the things that happened several decades ago, unless we're saying we don't have our own brain. We should have started. Yeah, I know the foundation was strong. They made sure that before they left, they had put certain things in place to use to control us. No doubt about that. But then what effort have we also made over the years to change those things? You will see that all of these countries you've called, none of them is faring any better. Yeah, we've made progress here and there. Flashes, I'll call it flashes of progress here and there. But in terms of real development, nothing much has happened.
Okay, so in terms of real progress and economic development, Professor Iwuagwu said nothing much has happened. And he also raised the point, because when I was even thinking about this, the 17 countries that gained independence in 1960, these countries, if you take a look at in Cameroon, for example, we've had one leader there for a sit-tight leader that rules from perhaps Switzerland or wherever he is. Senegal just got the youngest president in Africa. Togo, the story is almost the same. Niger now has a military has a military rulership. Cote d'Ivoire is just there. You know, that's a good expression, just like this. You know, which other country? Gabon. Okay, Mali, military. Chad, not so much. So Prof is actually entirely correct in terms of this. But the question now is that let's take a look at from when we got that independence to even some other economic policies that we've had. SAP, for example, Structural Adjustment Program, that a lot of Nigerians have not forgotten about. And many Nigerians are even saying that this current administration has also adopted that SAP measures, as it were, to look good before the IMF, the World Bank, and these Bretton Woods institutions. From SAP to all discovery and all commercialization to where we are right now, what's your assessment, Prof?
Yeah, before I answer, let me quickly come back to what Iwuagwu said. Why is that so, that these 17 countries have all had the same story to tell? It's a fundamental question you need to ask. So when we say we have been, we don't want to blame colonialism, we now need to ask the following point. If we don't blame colonialism, why is it that all the countries that came out of that colonial period, because I said the economics of decolonization is very important, because it is the economics of decolonization that laid the foundation for the state that we inherited and provided the type of structure that the leaders at independence inherited and tried to grow.
Can you break it down, Prof,
yeah,
a bit,
okay.
the economics of decolonization? Because
yes.
I'm thinking we had parliamentary rule, is that not what you're talking about?
That's not what we're talking about at all. When we talk about you see, at the eve of, after 1945, when the decolonization effort was a forced agenda, you know, when you don't plan for something and then it's only forced on you, you need to make this thing. Nigeria, for example, was a trader colony. That was the type of colony that Nigeria was, a trader colony. We had concessionary colonies and we had settler colonies in Africa by the British, Portuguese, and the French. In the settler colonies, they had to wage a bitter war to get independence. That laid the foundation. I mean, South Africa was the last of them. Angola from the Portuguese and things like that. The concessionary colonies like Zaire, they packed their bags and left with the country in tatters and did not put any structures in place. It translated to the type of things that was, because it was mining companies that started ruling the country, basically. And if you are a leader and you came out with politics to challenge these mining companies, they will rebel against you, you know, and proper people that will fight against you. Zaire, the DRC is still telling that story until today. So in Nigeria, the colonialists, the nationalists that inherited the colonial states, you know, were not oblivious of those structures. And if you recall, within 4 years of independence, we started having major crises in our polity, within 4 years. So really, the story of the economic development of Nigeria did not begin until 1970, if you look at it critically, because within 4 years, the political leadership were in crisis. You know, that crisis degenerated into a terrible civil war that was not resolved until 1970, you know, by a military regime that was struggling to make sense out of how to move Nigeria forward with some technocrats, some very brilliant technocrats that were there to support them. You know. So it was really the second national development plan, the Lagos Plan of Action, that was the first blueprint that said, okay, how do we transform this country from 1974 to 1975? Are you saying
that the problems we have today we're having those problems because of colonial masters?
On the one hand, and the nature and character of the ruling elite that emerged as a result of that colonial struggle and the policies that they decided to adopt. Because, you see...
But what we are seeing today,
yes.
Does it mirror what the Nnamdi Azikiwes, the Tafawa Balewas, the Ahmadu Bellos were? Is it what we are seeing today? Because that was part of my reminiscing this morning.
Yeah,
that how will they'll be turning in their graves?
When you look at some of the historical facts, you know, history has been very fair to these nationalists. When you look at the historical facts, you know, they were not all without blemish. They all had their own fundamental issues.
They had their own issues.
Yes, they were not perfect at all. They had their own issues. All the symptoms of the challenge that we have today were there in the First Republic. It's not as if they were not there. It was just that the magnitude with which it has raised Because over time, when you allow a system to fester, it grows. You know, that is the point. So in the process of making themselves into a capitalist focused ruling class, the people who inherited the Nigerian state from these nationalists after they had passed now picked up from where they stopped and continued in that trajectory. That is the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, Professor Iwuagwu, I know you've been listening to, okay, let's try to reconnect with him again. Okay, Prof, as we try to connect with Professor Iwuagwu, let me ask the question around, of course, in the 60s, the economy was agrarian-based. You mentioned the oil boom earlier. How has oil discovery and commercialization impacted economic policy and planning? If you take a look at Nigeria's translation of oil wealth, let's start from there, because, you know, thinking about it again over the weekend and even this morning, I was like, there's something they call the Dutch disease, you know, or the resource cost. We have oil, yet it has not translated to huge economic progress and economic prosperity for the people. So, Prof, go ahead.
Yeah, that oil was used to fund the Lagos Plan of Action, 1970 to 1974, and then the other development plans thereafter. It was oil that was used to fund it. So, if you look at the infrastructure that was laid, the roads that were built in the 70s, the industries that were built in the 70s, the institutions that were built in the 70s, all that came from oil. So we'll not sit down here and be unkind to our history by saying that not much has happened. Nigeria was awash with a lot of resources, and they used to build critical infrastructure for the nation at that point. The real issue was that from that point, from 1976 to 1979, when 78-79, when the civilians came back to power, you know, what then happened in terms of the transition between the military and the civilians? You know, civilians were now there for 4 years, and the military came back. What then happened? That is the critical part of our history as a nation and development, that we began to lose it, basically. If you want to draw a slide on where we started derailing, where we started undeveloping, it is that period from 1979 to 1984. And by the time the Babangida government took a decision to adopt SAP, the Structural Adjustment Program, but not take the Structural Adjustment Loan, we now begin to see the economic progress and resources that were put together. Because the 1974 plan basically said the state was going to control the commanding heights of the economy. The state was going to provide all manner of things for our citizenry. The state was going to be in front and help pull our people out of poverty and things like that. So all manner of policies were put into place. But thereafter, an erosion of the state as the commanding height of the economy began to take place because of a structural adjustment plan, which you have to tie to the international economy that we want to run away from, the IMF and World Bank, you know, and the policies that they met, the policies that they introduced that we adopted. And from that time till date, if you look at it, if you check your history very well, it has been on development, one form of undevelopment or the other.
Or the other. You know, what you're also saying, is also making me think about countries that did not adopt that had their own localized policies. How have they developed? But I'll come back to that.
Yes, a very interesting question you have asked, because
exactly.
If you now do that analysis, you will see very
there's
clearly.
There's a difference.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a difference. Okay, Professor Iwuagwu is with us now. Prof, it's also part of what we are saying, that the network is not good 64 years after. All right, Prof, I hope you can hear me now. We're still talking about this economic inequality. What can be done to address it? Despite Nigeria's vast oil wealth, gas potentials, billions, if not even trillions of dollars have been mined from the ground, sold internationally, yet many Nigerians are living in poverty as we speak. Poverty or even on every side, food poverty, energy poverty, malnutrition, everything. So, Prof, what do you think how do you think we can actually address this?
Yeah, because we have depended on one resource, that is also why we are suffering.
we need to diversify our economy. Our economy is just completely foreign driven. We have so many other products that we can begin to work on. It is because oil brings quick and cheap money that our politicians seem to have fallen in love with oil. Nobody is interested in developing the other sectors of the economy. And when there is a problem in that one sector that we depend on, our economy collapses. It has been happening over the years. We have other sectors. We have agriculture. We have mining, solid minerals, and so on. So many other. God has blessed us with so many resources that we can develop instead of depending on oil. What has happened to manufacturing? Even the oil, we export it raw, except the new thing that Dangote is doing. Even the oil. So you see that the price is not dependent on us. And that is why we're suffering. We have to find answers to these things. In my opening comment, that was what I meant by what have we done 60 years after to pick up from where our colonial masters left us. So we need to open up the other sectors of the economy. And for as long as we cannot do this, for so long, are we going to remain in the mess we found ourselves now?
Okay, Prof, let me still stick with you, because if you're talking about diversification, the way Nigeria's GDP is constructed now is diversified to an extent. You see that services is a huge part of Nigeria's GDP now. Even the oil that we're talking about in the last few years has not been contributing much, perhaps about 6%. I agree with you. There are some sectors within that GDP that are even currently in recession. Some parts, I think, crop in the agric space, we've also seen some sectors come up. The NBS would soon do a rebasing of the Nigerian economy, and when they come out with that, we'll see if indeed the economy has been more widened. So what exactly do you mean in terms of us diversifying the economy, or this diversification that we have, we're just paying lip service to it? Is that what you mean? Because if you're talking about diversification, we already have diversification.
There are other things that go with diversification. Those sectors we have mentioned are struggling. The man who brings gum arabic and all from Maiduguri, from Sokoto and all, before he comes to Lagos, where the port is, he has spent 3 times the money. So we have to talk about infrastructure development. Those things go hand in hand. If you diversify, you also do the enabling laws to attract investors. You do a legal system where the businessman is sure if he goes, he will get justice within a record time. So that the few people who have found themselves in those other sectors are struggling. They can do 5, 10 times more if they have the real things they need.
I think you just made a very good point there. If you take a look at even our creative economy and even other sectors that did not even need the help of government, yet they were able to raise their heads above water. So if we're doing the way we're doing now and you have a responsive government, you can imagine what we'll do. So Prof, let me come back to you with that question that I asked earlier. You know, it's interesting to have you both on the show today, professors of economic history, and I deliberately curated the show this way. It's a mix between economics and history. You know, I don't know about how your colleagues, the economists, will feel, or the historians will feel, but I really wanted to get to the nitty-gritty of it. So if we take a look at, because you actually mentioned earlier that from the time we started adopting those structural adjustment programs, even till now, that the economy has not really rebounded. Can we take a look at even history and look at some countries that had their own localized economic policies? Like I always say, we mustn't even adopt everything hook, line, and sinker. Can we Nigerianize some of our policies, bearing in mind the kind of economic or national development plan that we have, which is something else that I'll discuss sometime again?
That was what Babangida attempted to do when he said we will take structural adjustment program, but will not take the loan. Let us try and quote Nigerianize our economic foundations. But you see, in attempting to Nigerianize our economic foundations, the core of that foundation is supply-side monetary economics, which had come into being from same World Bank, IMF, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan type of economic framework that became popular within the context of development economics at that time. And virtually everybody who took that pill had big question marks on his economic output. It is the people who now looked at this pill and said, I will not swallow it, I'll go and do my own local concoction elsewhere, that were able to survive. The Singapores, the Malaysias, the South Korea to some extent. These were the people who now said, okay, let us see how we can break out of some of this stranglehold of these economic foundations to move forward. So when we look at the people who now planned the economy from 1984 onwards, they forgot that supply-side monetary economics has certain structural roots. You know very well what I'm talking about, that behoves on you to direct your economic structure in particular direction. And there's nothing you can do about it, no matter who is in charge, whether civilians or military. And that was what happened to these 17 other countries that we're mentioning in Africa. That's why they all went the same
you know
direction.
where my mind is going to, Prof, the Asian tigers.
Yes.
And I'm wondering,
Of
the
course.
Singapores,
Yes.
the Hong Kongs.
They towed a different line completely.
And many of them were in the same position as Nigeria was many years ago.
Yes, they saw what was happening around them, because remember Brazil was in that position as well. Argentina, the difference between Brazil and Argentina is that while Brazil broke out of that scene, Argentina continued. Mexico was in that same conundrum itself. What happened? Mexico also took its own destiny in its own hands. So why has the ruling elite in Nigeria not taken the leadership in his own hands and say, let us do something different for us? Because we have been in this for over 40 years. You remember, I'm sure Iwuagwu will remember that famous debate between Bala Osman and Yusuf Bangura, the nature of the Nigerian economic crisis, where we're talking about corruption, political structure, bad leadership, and all of those things. And Bangura, like said, all of those things are manifestations of the structural core that we have. And if we do not break up that structural core and reinvent ourselves, we're not going to do so. And the leadership, the Nigerian leadership were building themselves as a capitalist ruling class to properly inherit that state. And that is what privatization and all of this thing has done over time to where we are today.
Okay.
So for us to make progress, because the important thing is how do we make progress? But we'll come to that.
Yes,
okay.
I'll come to that. I'll come back to the political leadership and Nigeria's economic trajectory. But Prof, let me come to you with this question, since we're still talking about structural reforms. Looking ahead, what key structural reforms do you think that we need as we enter the 64th year, and perhaps for the future, that will make us grow and economically develop? Because there's a difference between economic growth and economic development. We're talking about World Bank, IMF. I read an article many years ago. I've forgotten who wrote that article now. How the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF turned the poor third world nations into loan addicts. And if you take a look at, yes, we are sort of loan junkies. Earlier on, before both of you came in, I talked about, in fact, I got the memo, I got the release from the World Bank this morning before I came into the studio, that it has given Nigeria about $1.5 billion. So we're still loan junkies, as it were. So, Prof, over to you.
I will also, just before that, I will also tell you what some of these Asian economies did, because we started with them, that we are not doing, and we have not done, and we're not still in a hurry to do it. And that explains why they are where they are today. Planning here is for the short term. And we have politicized economic development planning.
Yeah.
Take any of the Asian countries. You planned for 30 years, 20 years, 50 years. And they followed these plans religiously. Each administration that comes in follows it. But what is the experience of Nigeria? When we turn into the annual rolling plans and budget, everything went haywire. Of course, you know, some of our politicians do not even have an idea of governance until they enter government. When they enter, they set up all kinds of committees to come up with programs for them. You need to know the kind of people that are ruling us. You will shed tears. Most of them do not have an idea of what they want to do when they enter government. So the Asian countries had plans, long-term development plans, which was followed, which was not politicized. And that is what led them to where they are today. For them, development is out of politics. But ours is different. So until we begin to plan for the top, we must ask ourselves, what do we even want? Where are we going to as a nation?
Yeah.
What kind of development do we want? Where do we want to take our people? And so on, over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And each administration only comes to play their own role. Until we do that, it will not work.
Okay.
And that is what is going on here. Somebody starts building a stadium. Another person comes in and feels what he wants to do is to build an aircraft, maybe buy into
an airport.
Build a helicopter, whatever. And that is how we'll be ruled over the years. So that explains why the Asian countries are running and we're still crawling.
We're still crawling. The crawling giants, as it were. We're a giant of Africa. I don't know if we're still, because now economically we are like number 4. I don't know when the MBS rebases if we'll come back to number 1. Okay, Professor Ochefu, coming back, political leadership, let's link it with Nigeria's trajectory. And Professor Iwuagwu also mentioned something earlier in passing, and it made me remember Nigeria's demography. The young population of Nigeria, what does this demography represent? I've always said it here on the show. For those listening, for our political leaders to understand, because sometimes it seems as if they know they listen, or when they hear it goes out here, or they just block their ears. If Nigeria is a human being, if Nigeria is somebody now, that person is an 18-year-old person. Because that's the median age. That means that Nigeria as a human being is like 18-year-old. I was speaking with, I think, the Minister of Health and Coordinator, Social Welfare, Professor Ali Pate, some time ago, and I said, what would be the plans for an 18-year-old person? That should be what our leaders should be thinking. You know, this is a country that will birth many children, millions of children in a month. What does that demography represent? And the political leadership, the nexus between our trajectory.
How old was President Bola Tinubu when Nigeria became independent?
Perhaps, okay, how old is he now? So that we might not, we'll take it away. But I don't know, perhaps 50-something if I'm not mistaken. Because that's 25 years ago.
No, for
1999, when
Nigeria became independent.
Okay, when Nigeria, I thought when you said when he became governor.
No, okay. When Nigeria became independent.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So the generation that took us into independence, that led us into independence, are all gone, actively, and I mean physically. It was the generation, the people who constitute the core of the leadership today were born between 1955 or 1950 and 1965. So at independence, they were like 5 years old or 10 years old, and the case they are the oldest median, you know. And they did not become active players in the political space until they were in their 35 and 40s. This demography is very important because it prepares you to understand the mindset. You know, when you are asking this question that we have a 64-year-old country in the body of an 18-year-old person, young adult.
Yes, that's what it actually is.
Yes, that's what it comes to.
Yes.
So we need to ask those critical questions that from that generational perspective, you know, how do the people who inherited independence, the people who were young adults during independence in the First Republic, who now came into power and who are now ruling, how do they understand these generational dynamics? And the fact of the matter is that they really don't understand the generational dynamics. And I agree with Professor Iwuagwu that from the perspective of planning from day one, you know, remember I mentioned the fact that at independence we're asking critical questions. What type of education? Some people said mass education, some said qualitative education. What type of agriculture? You know, so within the context of an elite consensus, and within the context of the type of trajectory that they should all adopt, we got it all wrong. And by 1985, the class that says let us go this direction have been ruling us till today, and that has created a logic in what to do with these Nigerian states and which direction to move that Nigerian state.
Has the political class failed Nigerians successively?
Answer is a
Okay.
big answer is a big yes. I mean, there's no we can't run away from that fact. We cannot run away from that fact. If anybody tells you that the political class has not failed Nigeria, the person is not willing to be truthful. You know. Okay. Those of us, I mean, we are all actors in one way or the other. You know, there's no section of Nigerian society that has not been an active player in the political space. And we have all not played our parts the way we're supposed to play it.
Okay, Professor Iwuagwu, as we end the program, what key economic milestones do you want to proceed as we aspire in the next decade, for instance, or as we get gradually to 65 to 70? What would you like to see? What specific actions are necessary for us to get there?
First, we need to develop our infrastructure. Infrastructure in terms of rail, massive investment in rail, massive investment in roads, massive investment in air. These are the things that business does not do sentiment. These are real. And business will go to places where these things are taken for granted.
Okay.
So, we must go into manufacturing. Check all the nations, developed nations of the world. There is no nation that has developed without manufacturing, adding up to 30% to its GDP. What is manufacturing adding to your own GDP? And you expect to develop?
Okay.
You depend on oil, that the price and everything about it is internationally controlled. When you add value to your own product, you can determine the price, you can determine the supply, you can determine everything. We need to talk about our legal system. Some of these little things you think are nothing. Our politicians will tell you they are going to Europe to look for investors.
Foreign investors.
You don't go anywhere to look for investors. Those investors, they have brothers here. And they'll ask them, well, what is going on in Nigeria? They'll tell them, don't come. This place is nothing.
Okay.
Don't come. Except 1, 2, 3, you are ready to do this.
Okay, Prof.
And these are real.
Okay, Prof. Professor Ochefu, let me also ask you the same question. As an October baby, 64 years later, you have perhaps your children and even grandchildren. You know, what do you hope to see? What key milestones? Professor Iwuagwu has said infrastructure development, and we need to process what we mine. We also need to attend to manufacturing. What are your own solutions?
You see, one important question you didn't ask is that countries who have been where Nigeria is, how did they get out of it? All countries that have had massive economic downturns, the state comes out and takes the lead in providing emergency support to reflate the economy. So when Prof talks about infrastructure and all those things, this is what he talks about, and I'm on the same page with him. Now, our president is a child of the silent generation, you know, and if God gives the silent generation very long life, they have
And
barely
that's 20 years.
20 years,
Highest.
you know. So he, in his own case, is a date with history, you know. And how does he want to be remembered from history? He's having to take very tough decisions of an economic system that has congealed over 40 years. So it's like taking a decision, how do I get rid of a gangrenous wound? Do I chop it off or do I patch it?
Amputate the leg.
Yes, do I amputate the leg or do I patch it? You know, do I patch it with anesthesia or do I allow you to take the shock of the pain? And what many people are saying now is that they are trying to solve that gangrenous problem without giving anesthesia. And that is why the nation is in turmoil. But he needs to a radical departure from the norm. I was reading this morning, one of my friends, Tim Akano, sent a beautiful piece, and I was reading. And I was asking a simple question. What is Nigeria's benefit in OPEC? The major countries that started OPEC have left, and their economic fortunes have gone up.
Angola just left.
Yes,
yeah.
the economic fortunes have gone up. Why are we still doing in OPEC? What does OPEC do to us? Can we not pull out of OPEC and have something seriously at that level?
Prof.
Those type of decisions are very important that the president needs to look at and take.
Prof, you've just given me another food for thought that I will investigate and interrogate.
Please.
Thank you very much.
Share that with
yes,
you.
yeah, please do. So thank you very much, Prof, for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Professor Iwuagwu, also thank you very much for coming on the show and your thoughts. I've been speaking with Professor Yakubu Ochefu, Professor of Economic History Development Studies at Benue State University, and Professor Obi Iwuagwu, Professor of Economic History Development Studies and Public Policy at the University of Lagos. We've been looking at Nigeria's economic trajectory as we mark the 64th anniversary of our independence. All right, that's the much we can take on today's edition of the program. Thank you all for joining us. As we go, Timi Dakolo's song, Great Nation, comes to my mind. You know, what's the kind of nation that we want to build? Fantastic song. So I'll leave you guys with this. Be the best you can be and be the change that you want to see. I am Nancy Naji. Did I introduce myself earlier? But I am Nancy Naji. I'll see you all again next time. Thank you for watching. In case this is your first time watching us, thank you. Don't subscribe to the channel, drop your comments as well as like, and most of all, share our content. Bye.